Welcome to an emotional journey of strength, resilience, and the fight for justice. In this story, we follow Camille, a woman who enters the hospital for a routine surgery, but quickly finds herself facing mistreatment from a cold, dismissive nurse. As Camille battles not just physical pain, but the weight of systemic bias, she is forced to confront the very people meant to care for her. But what happens when her quiet strength pushes her to stand up for herself in ways she never imagined? And what changes will ripple out from her fight for dignity and respect? Before we dive into this powerful tale, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another story. Drop a comment below and let us know what you think Camille should do in the face of such injustice. Now, let's begin. Camille Johnson stirred under the crisp hospital sheets, her body heavy and weak from surgery. The dull ache in her side pulsed with each shallow breath, a constant reminder of the operation she had undergone the previous day. The sterile scent of disinfectant lingered in the air, mingling with the steady beeping of the heart monitor beside her bed. The room was silent but for the hum of medical machinery, a silence that made her feel more alone than she had in a long time. She opened her eyes slowly, the harsh fluorescent ceiling lights piercing her vision, forcing her to blink a few times until the room came into focus. The walls around her were a pale blue, void of any warmth or comfort. A small window on the far side of the room offered a sliver of sunlight, but it did little to chase away the coldness that permeated the room. Her throat was dry, her lips cracked from the lack of moisture, but there was no water within reach. She tried to move, but her body protested, every muscle aching as if it hadn't been used in weeks. Slowly, painfully, she pressed the call button at her bedside, hoping a nurse would come soon. Minutes passed, each one dragging like an eternity. No one came. The stillness of the room pressed down on her, amplifying the discomfort that gnawed at her insides. Her thoughts drifted to her husband, David. He had been at her side before the surgery, holding her hand and assuring her that everything would be okay. But now, he was hundreds of miles away on a business trip that he couldn't delay, unreachable in the remote part of the country where his work had taken him. She sighed, the weight of her isolation settling into her bones. She needed him now more than ever. But for the moment, she was on her own. The door to the room creaked open, and Camille's head turned weakly toward the sound. A nurse entered, her expression indifferent as she glanced at the chart hanging by Camille's bed. She was in her late 40s, with short blonde hair pulled into a tight bun and a pair of glasses perched on the tip of her nose. Her name tag read Karen Ross. "Good morning," Karen said flatly, not meeting Camille's eyes. Her tone was professional, but there was a coldness in her voice that made Camille uncomfortable. "Morning," Camille managed to croak, her throat still dry. "Could I have some water, please?" Karen didn't respond right away. She continued scribbling notes on the clipboard, her expression unmoved. After what felt like an eternity, she turned toward Camille with a forced smile. "I'll get to that in a minute," she said, her tone clipped. "How are we feeling today?" "Not great," Camille admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm still in a lot of pain. My side hurts a lot." "Well, you're on medication for that," Karen replied, almost dismissively. "It should be managing your pain just fine." Camille winced, unsure how to respond. The pain in her side was sharper than it had been when she woke up, but Karen didn't seem interested in addressing her discomfort. The nurse checked the machines, adjusting a few settings before turning her attention back to the clipboard. "Anything else?" Karen asked, her voice devoid of warmth. Camille hesitated. She wanted to ask for reassurance, for some small gesture of kindness. But Karen's demeanor made her feel like a burden, as if asking for anything would be an inconvenience. "No, that's it," Camille whispered, her heart sinking. Karen gave a curt nod, not bothering to look at Camille again as she turned to leave the room. The door closed with a soft click, and the silence returned. Hours passed, marked only by the rhythmic beeping of the machines and the occasional shuffle of footsteps in the hallway. Camille pressed the call button again, her pain increasing with each minute that passed without medication. The clock on the wall told her it had been nearly 4 hours since Karen had last checked on her, and still no one came. Her frustration grew as she lay there, helpless and in pain. She had always prided herself on her strength, on her ability to handle difficult situations with grace. But now, in this hospital bed, she felt small, powerless. The nurse's indifference gnawed at her, fueling a sense of injustice that she couldn't quite articulate. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Karen returned. She didn't apologize for the delay, nor did she acknowledge Camille's distress. Instead, she walked briskly to the IV drip, adjusting the flow without a word. "I've been waiting for hours," Camille said, her voice strained. Karen glanced at her, her expression unreadable. "We're busy," she replied shortly. "There are other patients who need attention too." Camille bit her lip, holding back the frustration that threatened to spill over. She didn't want to argue, didn't want to cause a scene. But the dismissiveness in Karen's tone made her feel invisible, as though her pain didn't matter. Karen left the room once more, and Camille was alone again. The next morning the door opened, and Camille felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps it was a different nurse today, someone who would show her the kindness she so desperately needed. But her hope quickly faded when she saw Karen's familiar figure enter the room. "How are we feeling today?" Karen asked, her tone just as cold as before. Camille hesitated, unsure of how to answer. She could feel the sharp ache in her side intensifying, and the constant dull throb in her abdomen was becoming unbearable. But there was something else, something deeper that was starting to hurt more than the physical pain. I'm still in a lot of pain," she admitted, her voice softer than she intended. "Can I get more medication?" Karen's expression didn't change. "You're already on the maximum dosage," she said curtly. "There's nothing more I can do for you." Camille felt a lump form in her throat. She wasn't just asking for medication. She was asking for acknowledgement, for someone to recognize that she was suffering. But Karen didn't seem to care. The nurse continued with her routine, checking the machines, scribbling notes on her clipboard, and barely glancing in Camille's direction. It wasn't just the lack of care that bothered Camille. It was the way Karen seemed to dismiss her completely, as though she wasn't worth the effort. The subtle but unmistakable sense that Karen's indifference had something to do with who she was, a black woman in a predominantly white hospital, weighed heavily on her mind. It was a thought she had tried to push away, but now it lingered, growing stronger with each passing day. By the third day, Camille's emotional state had deteriorated further. The physical pain was bad enough, but the emotional toll of being dismissed and disregarded was becoming unbearable. She had tried reaching out to her husband again, sending him text after text, but each message went unanswered. She knew he was on a work trip, but the lack of response made her feel even more isolated. The hospital room felt colder now, the walls closing in on her. She wanted to scream, to shout, to demand better treatment. But each time Karen entered the room, her energy drained, leaving her too weak to fight. It wasn't just the pain or the neglect. It was the way Karen looked at her, with a barely concealed contempt that Camille couldn't ignore any longer. The nurse's words were polite on the surface, but the underlying tone of disdain was unmistakable. "You know how it is," Karen had said to another nurse in the hallway earlier that day. "Some people just expect everything handed to them." Camille had overheard the comment, and though Karen hadn't said it directly to her, she knew it was meant for her ears. She felt the sting of those words, a familiar wound reopened by the casual racism that had followed her throughout her life. That night, as the pain in her side flared again, Camille pressed the call button once more. Minutes passed, and no one came. Desperate, she tried to sit up in bed, her body screaming in protest. She needed help, but no one seemed to care. Tears welled in her eyes, a mix of frustration and fear. She wasn't just in pain, she was afraid. Afraid that if she didn't speak up soon, she would be ignored until something went wrong. But what could she do? She was alone, and every time she tried to advocate for herself, she was met with indifference or disdain. As she lay back down, the tears finally spilled over. She had never felt so helpless in her life. The next morning, Camille woke to the sterile, impersonal quiet of her hospital room. The sunlight streaming through the window only served as a painful contrast to how she felt inside. Her body was sore, but it was the emotional toll of the last few days that weighed on her the most. Karen's dismissive treatment was becoming unbearable, and the realization that she was powerless in this environment deepened her sense of isolation. She pressed the call button again, wincing as a sharp pain radiated through her side. Her medication schedule was being poorly managed, and the wait for pain relief had become longer with each passing day. Every time she asked, Karen either brushed her off or claimed she was too busy to administer it on time. Camille checked her phone, hoping for a message from her husband, David. There was nothing. His absence was beginning to feel like an added layer of pain she couldn't bear. The door creaked open, and once again Karen entered with her usual cool demeanor. She didn't bother looking at Camille as she walked in, her focus already on the clipboard in her hand. "Good morning," Karen said flatly, barely acknowledging Camille's presence. Camille bit her lip. She didn't have the energy for pleasantries today. "I've been waiting for my pain meds," she said quietly, but firmly. "It's been over an hour." Karen glanced at the machines, her face expressionless. "You're scheduled for another dose soon," she replied, her voice lacking any empathy. "I'll get to it when I can." The subtle dismissal in her tone was unmistakable. It wasn't the first time Camille had heard that phrase, and it was starting to feel personal. She watched as Karen made quick, mechanical movements around the room, checking vitals, but avoiding any interaction. "I'm in pain now," Camille insisted, her voice cracking slightly. She hated how desperate she sounded, but the discomfort was becoming unbearable. "Can't I get it a little earlier?" Karen finally looked at her, her gaze sharp and unsympathetic. "I have other patients, Mrs. Johnson. You're not the only one here." Camille felt her stomach tighten. It wasn't just the words, but the way Karen said them, with an underlying tone that seemed to suggest Camille was being difficult, demanding. The interaction left her feeling small and ashamed, even though she knew she had every right to ask for relief. Karen left the room without another word, and the silence that followed was suffocating. Camille lay in bed, her body aching, her mind racing. Karen's attitude was wearing her down, and the subtle microaggressions were becoming harder to ignore. Every interaction felt like a test of endurance, not just against the pain in her body, but against the growing sense that she was being treated as less than. The door opened again, and this time a different nurse entered. Laura Perez, a younger woman with kind eyes and a gentle manner. She moved quietly around the room, adjusting the IV line with more care than Karen had ever shown. "How are you feeling today, Mrs. Johnson?" Laura asked, her voice soft and genuine. Camille sighed in relief. "Honestly, not great," she admitted. "It's been hard. The pain, it's a lot." Laura nodded sympathetically. "I'm sorry to hear that. I'll check on your medication and see if I can get something to help." Her tone was soothing, and for the first time in days, Camille felt like someone was actually listening. As Laura continued her work, Camille noticed Karen watching from the doorway. She stood there, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. It was only when Laura glanced in her direction that Karen turned and walked away, the tension between them palpable. "She'll take care of it," Laura said, offering Camille a small smile before leaving. But despite Laura's kindness, Camille knew Karen was still in control. The brief moment of comfort was overshadowed by the knowledge that Karen's presence loomed over her care. Camille had learned to be cautious, to hold back, to not push too hard. After all, she couldn't afford to anger the person responsible for her well-being, even if that person showed no interest in her pain. The days blurred together, each one a mix of pain and emotional strain. Camille's interactions with Karen had grown colder, and it was clear that the nurse's disdain was not just professional detachment, but something deeper. "You know how it is," Karen had muttered to another nurse during a brief exchange outside Camille's door. "Some people just don't know how to take care of themselves, always expecting more than they deserve." Camille had overheard the comment, and though Karen hadn't mentioned her by name, the implication was clear. She could feel the sting of those words. Some people. She knew exactly what Karen meant. The subtle racism, the unspoken biases, they were all there, simmering just beneath the surface of every interaction. It wasn't that Karen was openly hostile. It was the way she barely met Camille's eyes, the way she spoke as if Camille was an inconvenience. It was the way she avoided providing comfort or reassurance, leaving Camille to fend for herself emotionally. Camille had experienced this kind of treatment before. The small, almost invisible cuts that chipped away at her dignity over time. And yet what could she do? She was weak, recovering from surgery, and Karen was in a position of power. Camille knew that speaking up might make things worse. So, she swallowed her anger, choosing silence over confrontation. For now. The next day, Camille's frustration reached a breaking point. Her pain had become unbearable, and once again, Karen was nowhere to be found. The call button had been pressed repeatedly, but no one came. When Karen finally entered, her face set in its usual mask of indifference, Camille couldn't hold back any longer. "I've been waiting for hours," Camille said, her voice trembling with a mix of pain and anger. "This isn't right. I need help." Karen's eyes narrowed, and for the first time there was a flicker of something, irritation, maybe, in her expression. "I told you we're busy," she said sharply. "You need to be patient." "I've been patient," Camille snapped, surprising even herself with the intensity of her tone. "I'm in pain, and you're treating me like I don't matter." The room fell silent. Karen's face tightened, and for a moment Camille thought she might explode in anger. But instead, Karen smiled. A cold, dismissive smile. "You think I'm not doing my job?" Karen asked, her voice dripping with condescension. "You think you deserve special treatment?" Camille felt her stomach churn. This was it. The moment she had been dreading. The unspoken racism that had been hovering between them was now out in the open, though Karen hadn't said the words directly. But Camille heard them, clear as day. "No," Camille said, her voice shaking. "I just want to be treated with respect." Karen's eyes flashed with something dark, but she said nothing more. She turned on her heel and walked out of the room, leaving Camille alone once again. That night, Camille lay awake, the pain in her side throbbing, her mind racing. She picked up her phone, typing out another message to David. "Please come. I need you. I can't handle this alone." She stared at the screen, willing a response to appear. But the message remained unread, and the silence stretched on. Camille's heart sank as she realized that for now she was truly alone. Karen's words echoed in her mind, the way she had made Camille feel like she was asking for too much. Like she didn't deserve the same care as anyone else. The injustice of it all burned in her chest, but there was nothing she could do to make it stop. She closed her eyes, tears slipping down her cheeks as exhaustion finally overtook her. The next morning, Camille was greeted by the familiar sound of the door creaking open. She braced herself for another cold encounter with Karen, but to her surprise, it was Laura who entered the room. "Good morning, Mrs. Johnson," Laura said with a warm smile. "I'm here to check on you." Camille blinked, relief flooding her chest. She hadn't seen Laura in days, and her absence had only made Karen's treatment more unbearable. "How are you feeling today?" Laura asked, her voice filled with concern. Camille sighed. "It's been hard," she admitted. "The pain, it's not getting better." Laura frowned as she checked the IV and adjusted Camille's medication. "I'll talk to Dr. Anderson about increasing your dosage," she promised. "You shouldn't be in this much pain." For the first time in days, Camille felt like someone was actually looking out for her. Laura's presence was a reminder that not everyone in this hospital saw her as a burden. But the relief was short-lived. As Laura left the room, Camille caught a glimpse of Karen in the hallway, watching them with narrowed eyes. The tension between them hadn't disappeared. If anything, it had intensified. Camille knew that the next time Karen entered the room, things would only get worse. Over the next few days, Camille's relationship with Karen grew even more strained. The nurse's indifference had shifted into something more hostile, though still subtle enough to avoid outright confrontation. Karen delayed bringing her medication, claiming she was too busy, and when Camille asked for help, the nurse would sigh heavily, as if she was being asked to do the impossible. "You know," Karen said one afternoon, her voice low and bitter, "some people just don't know how to be grateful. They expect everything handed to them." Camille felt the words hit her like a punch to the gut. She knew what Karen was implying, that people like her, black women, were always seen as demanding, as expecting more than they deserved. It was a stereotype she had spent her whole life fighting against, but here, in this hospital bed, she felt powerless to resist it. The weight of Karen's treatment was becoming too much to bear. Camille's strength, both physical and emotional, was wearing thin, and she wasn't sure how much longer she could endure the nurse's quiet cruelty. That night, Camille reached for her phone again, her hands trembling as she typed out another message to David. "Please come. I need you. I don't know how much longer I can take this." She stared at the screen, waiting for a response that never came. The silence was suffocating, and Camille felt her heart sink deeper into despair. As she lay back against the pillows, her body weak and exhausted, she decided, when David returned, Karen would have to answer for her actions. Camille might be vulnerable now, but she wouldn't stay silent forever. She closed her eyes, clinging to the hope that David would come soon, and that when he did, things would finally change. The sun had set hours ago, casting Camille's hospital room into deep shadows. The only light came from the soft glow of the machines monitoring her vitals, casting long, eerie reflections on the walls. Camille lay still, the pain in her side dull and constant, her mind weighed down by exhaustion and frustration. Karen had been particularly cruel today. The little things, ignoring Camille's calls for help, pretending not to hear her requests, had piled up, grinding down Camille's spirit. She'd overheard another comment from Karen earlier. Some patients just want everything handed to them. They think they're more important than anyone else. It was said just loud enough for Camille to hear, and it cut deeply. Camille turned her head, staring at the cold, sterile room around her. She felt trapped. The walls seemed to close in, pressing against her as the weight of Karen's disdain and her own helplessness suffocated her. She needed to get out of here, but her body was weak, and David, her only real ally, was still unreachable. Every message she sent went unanswered, and each minute that passed without his response made her feel more isolated. Her phone sat on the bedside table just out of reach, mocking her with its silence. Camille had always been a strong woman, but now she wasn't so sure how much longer she could hold it together. The door to the room creaked open, and Camille tensed, bracing herself for another encounter with Karen. But it wasn't Karen. It was Laura. "Hey, Mrs. Johnson," Laura said softly, her kind face illuminated by the faint light from the machines. "I wanted to check on you before my shift ends. How are you feeling?" Camille blinked, her throat tightening with emotion. Laura's presence, though a small comfort, was a reminder that not everyone in this hospital viewed her as a burden. But the relief was short-lived. I'm managing," Camille whispered, though the truth was far darker than that. She wasn't managing at all. Laura frowned, sensing the heaviness in Camille's voice. She approached the bed, checking the IV and adjusting it carefully. "I'm sorry things have been so difficult," Laura said gently. I've noticed that Karen hasn't been as attentive as she should be." Camille hesitated, her heart pounding. It was the first time anyone had acknowledged the mistreatment she'd been enduring. But she was afraid to say too much, unsure if Laura could truly help. "I don't know what I've done wrong," Camille finally said, her voice trembling. "She treats me like I'm not even here." Laura's eyes softened. "You haven't done anything wrong, Mrs. Johnson. It's not you. Some people, they just don't know how to treat others with kindness." Camille swallowed hard, tears stinging her eyes. Laura's words were a comfort, but they didn't change the fact that Karen was still in control of her care. Camille felt trapped in a system that seemed indifferent to her suffering. "I just want to feel human again," Camille whispered, her voice barely audible. Laura nodded, her gaze filled with empathy. "I'm going to talk to Dr. Anderson about your medication. We'll make sure you're more comfortable soon, okay?" Camille nodded weakly, watching as Laura finished her checks and left the room. The door closed with a soft click, leaving Camille once again alone in the suffocating quiet. But at least now she knew she wasn't completely invisible. The next morning, Camille woke to the sound of the door swinging open. This time, it was Karen, her expression cold and distant as always. Camille braced herself for the usual indifference, but today something felt different. Karen's demeanor seemed even more dismissive than before, as if the brief confrontation from the previous day had only made her more determined to make Camille feel small. "How are we feeling today?" Karen asked, her voice laced with a false cheeriness that grated on Camille's nerves. "I'm still in pain," Camille said, trying to keep her tone steady. "I haven't been getting my medication on time." Karen raised an eyebrow, her lips curling into a small, mocking smile. "You've been getting your medication when it's scheduled, Mrs. Johnson. You just have to be patient." Camille's stomach churned. She had heard that phrase too many times now. The subtle way Karen dismissed her pain, treated her like an inconvenience. It was more than just the words. It was the way Karen looked at her, like she was nothing, like she didn't matter. "I don't think you understand," Camille said, her voice trembling with a mix of frustration and fear. "I've been waiting for hours. I need help." Karen let out a soft, dismissive laugh, shaking her head. "Some people just can't help themselves, can they?" she muttered, barely audible but loud enough for Camille to hear. The thinly veiled racism in her tone was unmistakable. Camille felt a surge of anger rise in her chest. She had spent days enduring Karen's subtle cruelty, her quiet dismissals, and now she couldn't take it anymore. "You think this is funny?" Camille snapped, her voice rising. "You've been ignoring me, treating me like I don't matter, and now you're laughing." Karen's eyes flicked to Camille, cold and hard. "I'm just doing my job, Mrs. Johnson. You're not the only patient here. But I'm the one you've been treating like this," Camille shot back. "I know what you're doing. You think I don't deserve the same care as everyone else." The room fell into a tense silence. Karen's expression shifted, her mouth tightening into a thin line. For a moment, Camille thought she might deny it, might try to gaslight her into thinking she was imagining it all. But instead, Karen took a step closer, her voice dropping to a low, venomous whisper. "You think you're special?" Karen hissed. "You think you deserve more than the rest of the patients here?" Camille's breath caught in her throat, her heart pounding. She hadn't expected Karen to be so blunt, so unapologetically cruel. The undercurrent of racism that had simmered beneath their interactions was now boiling to the surface. "I deserve to be treated with respect," Camille said, her voice shaking with emotion. "Just like anyone else," Karen smirked, her eyes gleaming with malice. "Well, let's just say I don't think people like you should be making demands." Camille's chest tightened, a wave of shock and anger washing over her. She had known, deep down, that this was the truth behind Karen's behavior. But hearing it said aloud, hearing the racism laid bare, was like a punch to the gut. For a moment, Camille was too stunned to speak. The silence in the room was heavy, suffocating. Karen seemed to sense Camille's shock, and for the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed her face. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by the same cold, detached expression. Without another word, Karen turned and left the room, the door closing behind her with a soft click. Camille lay there, her body trembling with anger and disbelief. Camille's hands shook as she reached for her phone, her fingers trembling so badly that she could barely type. She needed to talk to David, to tell him what had just happened. She needed him to do something, to intervene, to save her from this nightmare. But there was still no response. Her chest tightened as a wave of helplessness washed over her. She had always been strong, always able to stand up for herself, to fight for what was right. But now, lying in this hospital bed, weak and vulnerable, she felt like a different person. She felt powerless. The tears came suddenly, spilling down her cheeks as sobs racked her body. She tried to hold them back, tried to keep her emotions in check, but it was too much. The weight of everything, the pain, the isolation, the cruelty, came crashing down on her all at once. She cried for what felt like hours, the tears flowing freely as she let herself feel the full weight of her despair. It wasn't just about Karen or the pain she was in. It was about the way she had been made to feel. Small, invisible, unworthy of care. It was a feeling she had experienced too many times in her life, but it had never hit her this hard before. And now, it felt like she was drowning in it. Later that evening, as the sky outside darkened, Camille lay in bed, exhausted from the weight of her emotions. The tears had dried, but the sadness lingered, heavy and oppressive. She closed her eyes, trying to calm the storm inside her mind, but the sound of the door opening snapped her back to reality. She expected to see Karen again, but instead, Laura entered the room, her expression concerned. "Mrs. Johnson," Laura said softly, approaching the bed. "I heard you've been having a hard time today." Camille swallowed hard, her voice thick with emotion. It's been awful," she admitted, her eyes filling with tears again. "I don't know what to do. Karen, she's been—" Laura reached out and gently touched Camille's hand, offering her a small but comforting smile. "I know," she said quietly. "I've noticed, and I'm so sorry." Camille blinked in surprise. It was the first time anyone had openly acknowledged what she had been going through. Laura's words, though simple, brought an unexpected sense of relief. "I don't know why she's treating me this way," Camille whispered, her voice trembling. "I've never done anything to her, but it feels like she hates me." Laura's eyes softened, and she nodded. "I've seen her act like this before, but never this bad. It's not right." Camille felt a wave of gratitude toward Laura. In a sea of coldness and indifference, Laura was the one person who seemed to care, who saw her not just as a patient, but as a person. "I'm going to talk to Dr. Anderson," Laura said firmly. "I'll make sure you get the care you need, and I'll see if we can get someone else assigned to you." Camille's heart swelled with hope. It was a small gesture, but it felt like the first step toward regaining control over her situation. "Thank you," Camille whispered, her voice full of emotion. Laura gave her hand a reassuring squeeze. "You don't deserve this, Mrs. Johnson. No one does. We'll make it right." As Laura left the room, Camille let out a long, slow breath. The darkness still loomed, but there was a small light now, a glimmer of hope that things might finally start to change. The next morning brought a welcome shift in the atmosphere of Camille's hospital room. The sterile stillness remained, but there was a sense of anticipation building in the back of Camille's mind. She had sent countless texts to her husband, David, in desperation, hoping for a response that would bring some relief, some support. She hadn't expected him to arrive so soon. The sound of the door creaking open startled Camille from her thoughts. She turned her head slowly, expecting Karen's familiar face or perhaps Laura's kind presence. Instead, she was met with the sight of David Johnson, her husband, standing in the doorway, his face etched with concern. "Camille," David said softly, crossing the room in swift strides. His voice was full of emotion as he reached for her hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. Tears welled up in Camille's eyes as she looked up at him. The sight of him, her rock, her source of strength, brought an immediate sense of relief that she hadn't felt in days. "David," Camille whispered, her voice trembling with both exhaustion and overwhelming emotion. "I didn't think you'd come. I got here as soon as I could," David replied, sitting down beside her bed. His brows furrowed as he studied her face, noting the dark circles under her eyes and the exhaustion written all over her. "I'm sorry I wasn't here sooner. I didn't realize things had gotten this bad." Camille swallowed hard, her heart pounding in her chest. Now that David was here, the weight of everything she had been holding in threatened to spill over. She wanted to tell him everything, to pour out all the pain and frustration she had endured, but the words seemed lodged in her throat. "It's been awful," Camille finally said, her voice breaking. "Karen, the nurse, she's been treating me horribly. She ignores me, she delays my medication, and she says things that make me feel like I don't even deserve to be here." David's jaw clenched, his face darkening with anger. "What kind of things?" he asked, his voice tight. Camille hesitated, the memory of Karen's words replaying in her mind. "She made comments about me," Camille said, her voice barely above a whisper. "About people like me, like I don't deserve the same care as the other patients." David's expression hardened. He had always been calm and measured, but this time Camille could see the fury simmering just beneath the surface. He had dedicated his life to ensuring that people, all people, received the best care possible. And the thought of his wife being mistreated like this in his own hospital was too much to bear. "She didn't know who I was," Camille added, her voice shaking. I told her that you were my husband, but she didn't believe me. She laughed in my face." David's grip on her hand tightened, and he stood abruptly, pacing the small room with barely restrained rage. "This is unacceptable," he muttered under his breath. "This is beyond unacceptable." Camille watched him, her heart aching at the sight of his frustration. She had felt so alone for days, but now that David was here, she finally felt like someone was on her side. Still, a part of her worried about what would happen next. She didn't want to be the reason for a scene, but she couldn't bear the thought of enduring Karen's cruelty any longer. "What are you going to do?" Camille asked, her voice soft, but filled with uncertainty. David stopped pacing and turned to her, his expression resolute. "I'm going to handle this," he said firmly. "No one, especially not you, should be treated like this. Not in my hospital." It didn't take long for David to spring into action. After reassuring Camille that he would take care of everything, he left the room with a purpose, making his way directly to the hospital's administration office. His reputation preceded him. As the major shareholder of St. Joseph's Medical Center, he had the authority to demand answers and accountability. But before he reached the office, he stopped by Camille's room once more, intending to gather more details from Laura, who had been a bright spot in an otherwise bleak situation. As David stood outside the door waiting for the nurse, Karen appeared down the hallway, her expression as smug as ever. She hadn't noticed David yet, and when she saw him standing near Camille's room, she assumed he was just another visitor. Without skipping a beat, Karen approached him, her usual mask of indifference firmly in place. "Can I help you?" Karen asked, her tone laced with the same dismissiveness she had shown Camille. David turned to face her, his eyes narrowing slightly as he recognized her from Camille's description. This was the woman who had been mistreating his wife, the woman who had made her feel invisible, worthless. He kept his expression calm, though the fury simmered just beneath the surface. "I'm looking for my wife," David said, his voice cool and controlled. Karen glanced at the chart outside Camille's room and nodded toward the door. She's in there. I'll take care of her," she said, her tone dismissive, as though she had no interest in hearing anything further. David's expression darkened. He stepped closer to Karen, his voice lowering as he spoke. "Are you sure you've been taking care of her?" Karen blinked, a flicker of confusion crossing her face. "I'm doing my job," she replied, though there was a slight edge of defensiveness in her tone. David crossed his arms, his gaze piercing. "Because from what I've heard, it seems like you've been doing more harm than good." Karen's face paled slightly, but she quickly masked her surprise with an air of arrogance. "Look, I don't know what you've heard," she said, her tone growing sharper. "But I've been doing everything I'm supposed to do. Patients like her, they always want more than they're entitled to." David's eyes flashed with anger at her choice of words. Patients like her. The racist undertones of Karen's behavior were now glaringly obvious, and he had heard enough. "Do you know who I am?" David asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Karen paused, her expression faltering for the first time. She stared at him, clearly trying to assess the situation, but she had no idea who she was talking to. Finally, she shook her head. "No," Karen said, a hint of annoyance creeping into her voice. "Should I?" David's jaw tightened as he stepped closer. "I'm Dr. David Johnson," he said, his tone cutting through the air like a knife. "I'm the major shareholder of this hospital, and the woman you've been mistreating for days is my wife." Karen's eyes widened, her mouth opening slightly in shock. The arrogance and dismissiveness that had defined her demeanor moments ago vanished in an instant, replaced by a look of panic. I didn't know," Karen stammered, her voice trembling as she tried to regain her composure. "I didn't realize—" "But you did know," David interrupted, his voice sharp. "She told you who she was, and you didn't believe her. Instead, you laughed in her face and treated her with blatant disrespect. Now, you're going to answer for it." Karen's face flushed with fear as the weight of the situation crashed down on her. She took a step back, her hands trembling as she tried to come up with some defense. But there was nothing she could say to excuse her behavior. She had underestimated Camille, and now she was paying the price. After the tense exchange with Karen, David wasted no time in arranging a meeting with the hospital's administrator, Dr. Evelyn Carter, a no-nonsense woman in her 50s who had worked with David for years. Dr. Carter was known for her professionalism, but as David stormed into her office, it was clear that this was not going to be a routine conversation. "David, Doctor," Carter said, rising from her desk as he entered. "What's going on?" David didn't waste time with pleasantries. "We have a serious problem," he said, his voice tense. "One of your nurses, Karen Ross, has been mistreating my wife for days. I want her off Camille's case, and I want her dealt with immediately." "Doctor?" Carter's eyes widened in surprise, but she quickly composed herself, motioning for David to sit down. "Tell me what happened," she said, her tone calm but serious. David recounted the details of Camille's ordeal, from Karen's indifference to the thinly veiled racism that had poisoned her care. He didn't hold back, explaining how Camille had been made to feel small and powerless in her most vulnerable state. By the time he finished, Dr. Carter's expression was grim. "This is unacceptable," she said, her voice heavy with disappointment. "I had no idea this was happening. I'll take care of it." "She needs to be removed immediately," David said firmly. "Camille can't go through another day of this, and I want a full investigation into Karen's behavior. Who knows how many other patients she's treated this way." "Doctor?" Carter nodded. "Consider it done. I'll personally ensure that Karen Ross is taken off your wife's case, and I'll make sure we conduct a thorough investigation. This kind of behavior won't be tolerated." David exhaled slowly, some of the tension leaving his body. It was a start. He wasn't one to pull strings, but this was different. This was about Camille, and she deserved nothing less than to be treated with dignity and respect. "Thank you, Evelyn," David said, his voice softening. "I just want to make sure this never happens again." "Doctor?" Carter gave him a reassuring nod. "We'll handle it, and I'll make sure Camille gets the care she deserves from now on." Later that evening, David returned to Camille's room, a sense of calm returning to his demeanor. Camille watched him as he entered, her heart pounding with anticipation. She hadn't expected him to confront Karen so quickly, but she was grateful that he had. "What happened?" Camille asked, her voice soft but filled with hope. David sat beside her, taking her hand in his. "Karen's been taken off your case," he said gently. "Dr. Carter is launching an investigation. They're going to make sure this never happens again." Camille felt a wave of relief wash over her, tears welling up in her eyes. It wasn't over yet, but knowing that Karen would no longer be in control of her care was enough to lift the weight that had been pressing down on her for days. "Thank you," Camille whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "I didn't know how much longer I could take it." David leaned in, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. "You don't have to thank me. You deserve to be treated with respect, and I'll make sure that's what happens from now on." As they sat together in the quiet room, Camille felt the storm of the last few days begin to settle. She wasn't fully healed, but with David by her side and Karen out of the picture, she could finally start to breathe again. But deep down, Camille knew that the fight wasn't over. Karen might be gone, but the scars of her mistreatment lingered. There was still more to be done, more to confront, more to change. And Camille was ready. The following day, Camille woke with a mixture of apprehension and relief. The air in the room felt different. She knew Karen was gone, but the effects of the mistreatment lingered in her body and mind. As she slowly sat up, wincing at the dull ache in her side, she noticed Laura entering the room, her face filled with concern and warmth. "Good morning, Mrs. Johnson," Laura said softly, pulling up a chair beside Camille's bed. "How are you feeling today?" Camille offered a tired smile. "Better now that she's gone." Laura nodded, her gaze softening. "I heard about the investigation. I'm so sorry you had to go through that." Camille looked down at her hands, the weight of the past days settling in her chest. It wasn't just the physical pain, she admitted quietly. It was the way she made me feel, like I didn't deserve to be treated like everyone else. Laura placed a gentle hand on Camille's arm. You do deserve it, and what she did was wrong. I just want you to know that we're all behind you. Camille felt a surge of gratitude. For the first time in days, she didn't feel completely alone in her fight. Thank you, she whispered, her eyes filling with tears. It means a lot. Before Laura could say more, the door opened and Dr. Evelyn Carter entered, her expression serious but composed. She had personally taken over the investigation and was here to update Camille on the next steps. Mrs. Johnson, Dr. Carter began, pulling up a chair next to the bed. I want to start by saying how deeply sorry I am for everything you've been through. This hospital prides itself on its patient care, and it's clear that Karen Ross failed to meet those standards. Camille nodded, her throat tight with emotion. It was surreal to hear someone in authority acknowledge what she had endured. It felt like the beginning of a reckoning, not just for Karen, but for the way things had been handled from the start. We've launched a full investigation, Dr. Carter continued, her tone professional but empathetic. I've already spoken to several members of the nursing staff, including Laura, and we're gathering more testimony. Karen has been placed on immediate leave, pending the results of our inquiry. If we find any more evidence of misconduct, she will be terminated. Camille exhaled, feeling the tension in her chest slowly begin to ease. It wasn't over yet, but knowing that Karen was being held accountable was a relief. We'll keep you updated every step of the way, Dr. Carter assured her. And in the meantime, if there's anything you need, anything at all, don't hesitate to let us know. Camille, mes docteur. Carter's gaze, her voice steady as she responded. I just want to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else. Not here, not anywhere. Doctor, Carter nodded, her expression serious. We're committed to that. This hospital will not tolerate behavior like Karen's. With that, Dr. Carter stood, giving Camille a reassuring smile before leaving the room. Laura stayed behind, offering Camille a glass of water and a moment of quiet before she left as well. As the door clicked shut, Camille lay back against the pillows, her heart pounding with a mix of emotions. She wasn't done fighting, not yet, but for the first time, she felt like her voice was being heard. Later that afternoon, Camille received a text from David. I'm meeting with Karen and the administration. I'll make sure she answers for what she's done. Her heart raced as she read the message, knowing that the moment she had been dreading and anticipating was about to happen. Karen would finally have to face the consequences of her actions. But Camille also felt a pang of uncertainty. Would Karen apologize? Would she acknowledge the pain she had caused? Or would she continue to deny everything, hiding behind the shield of indifference that had defined her treatment of Camille? As Camille waited for an update, she couldn't help but think back to every moment Karen had made her feel small. Every time she had ignored her calls for help, dismissed her pain, and, worst of all, made those thinly veiled racist remarks. The anger bubbled up inside her, but she pushed it down, reminding herself that this confrontation was necessary for her healing. Karen had to be held accountable, not just for Camille's sake, but for every patient who had been mistreated by her. Down the hall in a private meeting room, David stood beside Dr. Carter and the hospital's chief administrator, Mr. Patrick Ward, a tall, serious man with graying hair. They were seated across from Karen, whose face was as pale as Camille had ever seen it. Gone was the smugness, the arrogance that had marked her interactions with Camille. In its place was fear. Fear of losing everything she had built over her 20 years at the hospital. Karen, Dr. Carter began, her voice firm. We've gathered testimony from multiple staff members, including Nurse Laura Perez, and it's clear that your behavior toward Mrs. Camille Johnson was unacceptable. Karen's mouth opened and closed, as if she were searching for the right words to defend herself, but nothing came. The weight of the room, of the evidence against her, seemed to press down on her shoulders, making it impossible for her to muster any of the bravado she had shown before. She told you who she was, David said, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. She told you she was my wife, and you didn't believe her. Instead, you mocked her. You dismissed her pain. You made her feel less than human. Karen flinched at David's words, her hands trembling in her lap. I didn't mean to. You meant every word, David interrupted, his voice rising. You made comments about people like her not deserving the care they needed. You treated her like she was a burden, like she was beneath you. Karen's face flushed with shame, but she still tried to defend herself. I was overwhelmed, she said weakly. I had so many patients and I— Don't lie, Dr. Carter cut in, her voice cold. We've spoken to the staff. You weren't overwhelmed. You singled out Mrs. Johnson and treated her differently because of who she is. Karen's lip quivered, and she looked down at her hands. I didn't realize how it was coming across, she mumbled. David's fists clenched at his sides. It's not just about how it came across, Karen. It's about the harm you caused. My wife, the woman you were supposed to care for, felt dehumanized because of your actions. Karen's eyes filled with tears, but David wasn't moved. He had seen too much damage, too much cruelty, to be swayed by her sudden display of remorse. You're going to face the consequences of your actions, Doctor, Carter said, her voice steady and resolute. You've been placed on leave, and pending the results of this investigation, it's highly likely that you will be terminated. Karen's face went white. She opened her mouth to protest, but no words came out. The gravity of the situation finally hit her, and she slumped back in her chair, defeated. Is there anything you'd like to say before we conclude this meeting? Mr. Ward asked, his voice formal. Karen hesitated for a long moment, her eyes darting from Dr. Carter to David to the floor. Finally, she spoke, her voice trembling with fear. I'm sorry, Karen whispered. I didn't mean for things to get this bad. I'm so sorry. David stared at her, his expression unreadable. He had waited days to hear those words, but now that they were finally spoken, they felt hollow, empty. I don't think you understand the damage you've done, David said quietly. But my wife deserves better than this. She deserves better than you. With that, Dr. Carter called the meeting to an end, her voice final. Karen, you are dismissed. We'll notify you of the next steps once the investigation is complete. Karen stood slowly, her hands shaking as she gathered her things. She didn't look at David or Dr. Carter as she left the room, her head hanging low. The door closed behind her with a soft click, and the silence that followed was heavy with the weight of everything that had just transpired. David returned to Camille's room later that evening, his face a mixture of exhaustion and relief. Camille watched him as he entered, her heart pounding with anticipation. What happened? Camille asked, her voice soft but steady. David sat beside her, taking her hand in his. She's gone, he said simply. They're investigating her fully, but she's been placed on leave. She won't be coming back. Camille exhaled slowly, a sense of relief washing over her. It wasn't a full victory yet, but knowing that Karen wouldn't be in charge of her care any longer felt like a weight had been lifted from her chest. And did she say anything? Camille asked hesitantly. David nodded. She apologized, he said, though there was a trace of bitterness in his voice. But it wasn't enough. It won't undo what she did. Camille closed her eyes for a moment, processing everything. She had waited so long for this, for Karen to face the consequences, for justice to be served. And while part of her felt vindicated, there was still a lingering sadness. The damage Karen had done couldn't be erased with a simple apology. But this was a start. Over the next few days, Camille's recovery slowly began to improve. With Karen gone, she felt lighter, less burdened by the emotional weight that had been pressing down on her for so long. Laura continued to care for her, providing the kindness and compassion that Camille had so desperately needed from the start. David stayed by her side as much as possible, offering her support and comfort in the quiet moments between doctor visits and medication rounds. The hospital administration kept her updated on the investigation, and though the final outcome hadn't been decided yet, Camille knew that justice was being done. But more than that, she knew she had her voice back. She had fought for herself, and with David's help, she had made sure that Karen would never treat another patient the way she had treated her. And that, above all else, gave her the strength to keep going. It had been a few days since Karen had been removed from her position, and while Camille felt a sense of justice, there was an unexpected heaviness that weighed on her mind. Lying in her hospital bed, recovering from surgery, she should have felt relieved. Karen's actions had been exposed, and the hospital had taken the first steps to hold her accountable. But Camille found herself grappling with emotions she hadn't anticipated: guilt, sadness, and uncertainty. Laura entered the room with her usual warm smile, but even her comforting presence couldn't fully ease the burden on Camille's heart. "How are you feeling today, Mrs. Johnson?" Laura asked, adjusting the IV and checking the monitors. Camille sighed, her voice low. "Physically, I'm doing better. But emotionally, it's harder than I thought it would be." Laura paused, her expression softening with concern. "Do you want to talk about it?" Camille hesitated, unsure of how to put her feelings into words. I keep thinking about what happened," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "I feel guilty in a way. I know Karen was wrong, but now that she's facing the consequences, I wonder if I was too harsh. I didn't want to ruin her career. I just wanted her to stop treating me like I didn't matter." Laura pulled up a chair and sat beside Camille, her gaze full of empathy. "You're not responsible for what happens to Karen. She made her choices. You were just standing up for yourself, and you had every right to." "I know," Camille said softly, wiping away a tear that had escaped. "But I can't help thinking about how everything turned out. What if she loses her job? What if her whole life is turned upside down because of this?" Laura shook her head gently. "Karen's actions are her own. You can't carry the weight of her mistakes. What happened wasn't just about one bad day. It was a pattern of behavior. And if you hadn't spoken up, it might have continued with other patients." Camille nodded, her chest tightening. She knew Laura was right, but that didn't make the guilt go away. She had always believed in fairness, in giving people the benefit of the doubt. And now, she wondered if she had done enough to help Karen see the error of her ways before things had escalated. Later that day, as Camille rested in the quiet room, her mind drifted to the many times in her life when she had encountered subtle forms of discrimination, microaggressions, dismissive comments, moments when people had treated her as if she were invisible. These experiences had accumulated over time, but she had always pushed through them, telling herself that it wasn't worth the fight, that she had bigger battles to win. But this time, it had been different. She couldn't push it aside, couldn't ignore it. The stakes had been too high. Her health, her dignity, her sense of self. She had to confront Karen, even though it went against her instinct to avoid conflict. Camille stared out the window, watching the world outside move forward while she felt stuck in place. She knew she should be proud of herself for speaking up, but the emotional toll of standing up to Karen was harder to bear than she had anticipated. She wondered if other patients who had faced similar treatment had ever felt this way, torn between relief and regret, between empowerment and guilt. That evening, David returned to the hospital after finishing up meetings with the hospital's administration. He walked into Camille's room with a soft smile, but he could immediately sense the change in her mood. He pulled a chair beside her bed, taking her hand gently. "You're quiet tonight," David said, his voice full of concern. "What's on your mind?" Camille hesitated, unsure of how to express the conflict she felt inside. "I've just been thinking a lot about everything that's happened," she admitted. "I should be happy that Karen is finally being held accountable, but instead, I feel guilty. Like maybe I overreacted." David frowned, his brow furrowing in confusion. "Overreacted? Camille, you were mistreated. Karen disrespected you, dismissed your pain, and made you feel less than human. You had every right to demand better treatment." "I know," Camille said softly, her eyes filling with tears. "But I keep thinking about how this will affect her life. What if she loses her job? What if she has a family to support? I don't want to be the reason her life falls apart." David squeezed her hand, his voice firm but compassionate. "Karen's life isn't falling apart because of you. It's falling apart because of the choices she made. She could have chosen to treat you with respect, but she didn't. She could have listened when you asked for help, but she didn't. You didn't create this situation. She did." Camille nodded, but the weight of her emotions still lingered. I just didn't expect it to feel like this, she whispered. I thought standing up for myself would feel empowering, but now I'm not sure. David's expression softened, and he leaned in closer. It's normal to feel conflicted, Camille. You're a kind person, and it's hard for you to see anyone suffer, even someone who wronged you. But you did the right thing. You stood up for yourself when it mattered most. And in doing that, you may have helped prevent her from treating others the same way. Camille wiped her tears, her heart heavy, but her mind starting to clear. David's words were a reminder that she hadn't just spoken up for herself, she had spoken up for others too. The next morning, Laura returned to Camille's room with a small bouquet of flowers. Camille's heart lifted at the sight, and she smiled as Laura placed the flowers on the bedside table. I thought you could use something to brighten up the room, Laura said warmly. They're beautiful, Camille said, her voice full of gratitude. Thank you. Laura sat beside Camille, her expression thoughtful. I wanted to check in with you about something, she began. I know the past few days have been really hard, and I've noticed you've been a bit down. I just want to remind you that you're not alone in this. Camille nodded, appreciating Laura's kindness. It's just been a lot to process, she admitted. I didn't expect to feel so conflicted after everything with Karen. I guess I thought I'd feel stronger. Laura smiled gently. Healing, both physically and emotionally, isn't always straightforward. It's okay to feel what you're feeling. Guilt, sadness, even relief. You've been through a lot, and it's going to take time to work through all of it. Camille looked down at her hands, her mind swirling with thoughts. I keep thinking about all the other patients she might have treated the same way, she said quietly. I wonder if they felt as helpless as I did. Laura nodded, her expression serious. That's something I've been thinking about too. And I want you to know that the hospital is taking this seriously. They're looking into Karen's past cases, and they're implementing new policies to make sure that no one else slips through the cracks. Camille's heart swelled with a mixture of gratitude and hope. Thank you, she said softly. That means a lot. Laura squeezed Camille's hand. You're making a difference, Mrs. Johnson. By speaking up, you've already started to create change. Later that afternoon, Dr. Carter entered Camille's room with a calm, composed expression. She pulled up a chair beside the bed and gave Camille a small nod of acknowledgement. I wanted to check in with you personally, Dr. Carter said. We've been conducting a thorough investigation into Karen's behavior, and I wanted to update you on our progress. Camille felt her heart race, wondering what new information Dr. Carter might have uncovered. Is there more evidence of what she's done? She asked cautiously. Dr. Carter nodded, her expression serious. Yes, we found more instances of Karen mistreating other patients, particularly patients of color. It seems that her behavior toward you wasn't an isolated incident. Camille's stomach twisted at the thought. She had suspected that she wasn't the only one, but hearing it confirmed brought a fresh wave of sadness. We're taking swift action, Dr. Carter continued. Karen's leave has been extended, and it's highly likely that she will be terminated. We've also started reviewing our policies to ensure that something like this doesn't happen again. Camille nodded, her emotions swirling, while the news of Karen's imminent termination brought some relief. The weight of knowing that others had suffered the same treatment hung heavy in her heart. Thank you for keeping me updated, Camille said softly. I just want to make sure that this never happens again. Doctor? Carter offered a reassuring smile. We're committed to that, Mrs. Johnson. Your courage in speaking up has already made a difference. As Dr. Carter left the room, Camille lay back against the pillows, her mind racing with thoughts of the past few days. The guilt, the sadness, and the uncertainty still lingered, but for the first time, she began to feel a sense of peace. That evening, as the sun began to set outside her window, Camille found herself reflecting on everything she had been through. The mistreatment, the confrontation, and now the slow process of healing. She hadn't expected it to be easy, but she had also never anticipated the complex emotions that would come with standing up for herself. David sat beside her, his hand resting gently on hers. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the soft orange glow of the sunset filter through the curtains. "You've been so strong through all of this," David said quietly. "I'm proud of you." Camille smiled faintly, though her heart still felt heavy. "I don't feel strong," she admitted. "I feel tired and conflicted." "That's part of being strong," David said softly. "It's not about always feeling powerful. It's about pushing through, even when you don't feel like you can. You've been through something difficult, and you didn't give up." Camille nodded, tears welling in her eyes once again. "I'm just glad it's almost over," she whispered. "I'm ready to move on." David smiled, leaning in to press a gentle kiss to her forehead. "You will. And when you're ready, we'll leave this place behind and focus on what's ahead." As Camille leaned into David's embrace, she felt a flicker of hope rise within her. The journey wasn't over, but she had survived the worst of it. And now, with David by her side, she knew she had the strength to face whatever came next. The days following the investigation felt lighter, as though a dark cloud had been lifted from the hospital. Camille's recovery was progressing steadily, and with Laura continuing to oversee her care, she finally felt like she was in good hands. Even so, there was an undercurrent of anticipation, a sense that something bigger was about to happen. Camille had seen glimpses of the systemic change the hospital was undergoing, but she knew that the real test was yet to come. The next morning, as the sun streamed through the window, Camille woke to the sound of her phone buzzing. It was a message from David. "Meeting with the administration today to discuss new policies. Want to be there?" Camille's heart skipped a beat. She knew this was the moment she had been waiting for. The chance to make sure the changes she had fought for would be permanent. Her fingers trembled slightly as she typed back, "Yes, I need to be there." Later that afternoon, Camille found herself seated in the hospital's boardroom, flanked by David on one side and Dr. Evelyn Carter on the other. Across the table sat Mr. Patrick Ward, the hospital's chief administrator, along with several other key decision-makers from the administration team. The air in the room was charged with anticipation as they prepared to discuss the changes that would come in the wake of Karen's actions. David sat upright, his face calm but focused. Camille had always admired his ability to remain composed in high-pressure situations, and today was no exception. She, on the other hand, felt her heart pounding in her chest, a mix of nerves and determination surging through her. "Thank you all for being here," Mr. Ward began, his voice steady and authoritative. "We're here today to address the serious allegations regarding Nurse Karen Ross's behavior and to discuss the steps we will be taking to ensure that something like this never happens again." Camille glanced at David, who gave her a reassuring nod. This was her moment, the time to make sure her voice was heard, not just for herself, but for every patient who had been treated unfairly. "Doctor?" Carter spoke next, her tone measured but firm. "We've completed our investigation into Karen Ross's conduct, and as you all know, the findings were deeply troubling. Mrs. Johnson was subjected to inappropriate behavior, and our investigation has uncovered a pattern of similar incidents involving other patients." Camille's heart clenched at the mention of other patients. She had suspected that Karen's mistreatment wasn't limited to her, but hearing it confirmed brought a fresh wave of sadness. "We've already taken action to remove Karen from her duties, and she will not be returning to this hospital." "Doctor," Carter continued, "but this is only the beginning. We need to address the systemic issues that allowed this behavior to go unchecked for so long." Camille leaned forward, her voice quiet but strong as she spoke. "It's not just about Karen, it's about making sure that no one else has to go through what I did." The room fell silent as all eyes turned to Camille. She could feel the weight of her words, the importance of this moment pressing down on her. But instead of fear, she felt a sense of clarity, a determination to make a difference. "I know I'm not the only one who's been treated this way," Camille continued, her voice gaining strength. "There are others who might not have had the chance to speak up, and if we don't make changes now, it could happen again." Mr. Ward nodded thoughtfully, his expression serious. "You're right, Mrs. Johnson. We have to take this opportunity to create meaningful change. We've already started reviewing our policies, but we want to hear your input on what needs to happen." Camille felt a surge of gratitude. They were listening. They were willing to make things right. "First," Camille began, "there needs to be better training on racial bias and patient care. Every staff member should be required to undergo training that helps them understand how their actions, even subtle ones, can harm patients." "Dr." Carter nodded, making notes as Camille spoke. "We're already planning to implement mandatory diversity and inclusion training, but we can expand it to include a focus on racial bias in healthcare." Second," Camille continued, "there needs to be a way for patients to report concerns without fear of retaliation. If I hadn't had David's support, I don't know if I would have been able to speak up. But not everyone has someone advocating for them." David squeezed her hand, his face full of pride. "Mr. Ward leaned forward. "We're considering creating a patient advocacy program, a system where patients can report concerns directly to an independent team. This would ensure that complaints are taken seriously and handled without bias." Camille nodded, her heart swelling with hope. This was what she had been fighting for, a chance to create lasting change that would protect future patients. Over the next hour, the discussion continued, with Camille and David providing input on the hospital's new policies. The administration listened closely, eager to address the gaps in their system and prevent future incidents of mistreatment. By the end of the meeting, a comprehensive plan was in place. Mandatory racial bias training for all staff would begin immediately, and a patient advocacy program would be launched within the next few months. Additionally, a new protocol for handling patient complaints was established, ensuring that all concerns would be addressed by an independent review board. As the meeting concluded, Mr. Ward turned to Camille, his expression serious but kind. "Mrs. Johnson, I want to thank you for your courage in coming forward. Your experience has highlighted some serious issues, and we're committed to making sure that this hospital becomes a place where every patient feels safe and respected." Camille smiled, her heart full of gratitude. "Thank you," she said softly. "I just hope this makes a difference." David stood beside her, his hand resting on her shoulder. "It already has," he said. "You've helped create real change." In the weeks that followed, Camille's physical recovery continued at a steady pace. But it wasn't just her body that was healing. Her heart and mind were beginning to mend as well. The emotional scars left by Karen's mistreatment were still there, but they no longer felt as heavy. Knowing that she had made a difference, that the hospital was actively working to prevent future harm, gave her a sense of peace. One afternoon, as she rested in her hospital room, Laura entered with a broad smile on her face. "I have good news, Mrs. Johnson," Laura said, her eyes twinkling with excitement. "The administration has officially launched the patient advocacy program, and they're naming it after you. It's going to be called the Johnson Patient Advocacy Initiative." But Camille's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't expected this. "They're naming it after me?" she asked, her voice full of disbelief. Laura nodded, her smile widening. "It's their way of honoring your courage and ensuring that what you went through won't happen to anyone else." Tears welled up in Camille's eyes, but this time they were tears of gratitude. "I don't know what to say," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You don't have to say anything," Laura said gently. "You've already said and done so much. This is just a way to make sure your legacy of advocacy continues." As Laura left the room, Camille lay back against the pillows, her heart full. She had come to the hospital as a patient, vulnerable and afraid. But now, she was leaving with a sense of strength and purpose she hadn't felt in a long time. Several days later, Dr. Carter stopped by Camille's room with an update on Karen's case. Camille's stomach tightened slightly as she prepared herself to hear the outcome. "Mrs. Johnson, I wanted to inform you that Karen Ross has officially been terminated from her position here at St. Joseph's," Dr. Carter said, her voice calm but firm. "The investigation confirmed that her behavior toward you and other patients was part of a pattern. We couldn't allow her to continue working here." Camille exhaled slowly, a mix of emotions swirling within her. She had known this was coming, but hearing it confirmed brought a sense of closure. Karen's actions had been exposed, and justice had been served. "I know this can't undo what happened to you, Doctor," Carter continued, "but I hope it brings you some peace, knowing that she won't be able to harm anyone else." Camille nodded, her voice steady as she replied, "It does bring me peace. I just hope she learns from this." "Doctor?" Carter gave a small, understanding smile. "We all do." As Dr. Carter left the room, Camille let out a deep breath, feeling the weight of Karen's mistreatment finally lift from her shoulders. It wasn't easy to accept that someone had lost their job, but Camille knew it was necessary. Karen had caused real harm, and now she was facing the consequences. A few days later, Camille was discharged from the hospital. David stood by her side, helping her into the car as they prepared to leave St. Joseph's behind. As they pulled away from the hospital, Camille couldn't help but reflect on everything that had happened. She had come to this place in pain, not just physically, but emotionally. She had been mistreated, dismissed, and made to feel small. But in the end, she had found her voice, and with it, the strength to stand up for herself and others. As they drove home, David glanced at her, a proud smile on his face. "You did it," he said softly. "You changed things." Camille smiled back, her heart full of gratitude and hope. "We did it," she corrected, taking his hand in hers. The road ahead was bright, and for the first time in a long while, Camille felt at peace. She knew that the scars would remain, but they no longer held her back. Instead, they were a testament to her strength, and a reminder that no matter how dark things got, there was always light on the other side. The drive home from St. Joseph's Hospital felt surreal to Camille. As the cityscape rolled by outside the car window, she was struck by how different everything seemed. The sun was shining, the streets were busy with people going about their daily lives, and yet she felt like a different person than the woman who had entered the hospital weeks ago. Her body was still healing from the surgery, but emotionally, she had undergone a transformation. David sat beside her, his hand resting gently on her knee as he drove. Every now and then, he glanced at her with a look of admiration and pride, as if he couldn't believe how strong she had been throughout the ordeal. "Are you okay?" David asked, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them. Camille nodded, offering him a small smile. "I think so," she said softly. "It's just strange to be going home. I thought I'd feel completely relieved, but it's more complicated than that." David nodded, understanding in his eyes. "You went through a lot in that hospital. It's normal to feel conflicted. You fought for your dignity, for justice, and even though things turned out the way they should, it doesn't erase the pain you went through." Camille sighed, leaning her head against the cool glass of the window. "I know you're right," she whispered. "I'm just glad it's over." David smiled gently, keeping one hand on the steering wheel while reaching over to take her hand in his. "It is over, and you're stronger because of it. You did something incredible, Camille. You changed things for the better." Camille squeezed his hand, her heart swelling with gratitude. David had been her anchor throughout this entire ordeal, and she couldn't have made it through without him by her side. When they finally arrived home, Camille felt a wave of relief wash over her as she stepped through the front door. The familiar scent of lavender candles greeted her, and the warm, cozy atmosphere of their home immediately began to soothe the tension in her body. It felt like a safe haven after the cold sterility of the hospital. David helped her settle onto the couch, propping pillows behind her to make sure she was comfortable. As she sat there, surrounded by the comfort of home, Camille felt a sense of peace begin to settle over her. The weight of the hospital experience was still there, but it no longer felt as heavy. "I'll make us some tea," David said, heading to the kitchen with a smile. Camille nodded, closing her eyes for a moment and taking a deep breath. She had always loved the simple pleasures of life at home. The smell of tea brewing, the softness of her favorite blanket, the quiet comfort of David's presence. Now, those small things felt even more precious. As she waited for David to return, Camille reflected on everything that had happened over the past few weeks. The mistreatment, the confrontation, and the resolution had all left their mark on her. But despite the pain and frustration, she had emerged stronger. She had found her voice in a situation where it would have been easy to stay silent, and she had used it to make a difference. When David returned with 2 steaming mugs of tea, Camille smiled up at him, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for the life they had built together. "Thank you," she said softly, taking the mug from his hands. David sat beside her, his arm resting along the back of the couch as they sipped their tea in companionable silence. "For what?" he asked, a hint of amusement in his voice. "For being there," Camille replied. "For supporting me when I didn't even know if I could get through it." David's expression softened, and he leaned in to kiss her forehead. "You never needed me to get through it," he said. "You're strong enough on your own. I'm just glad I could be there to remind you of that." Camille smiled, her heart swelling with love for him. "I'm glad too." A week after returning home, Camille received a message from one of her closest friends, Monica, asking if she could stop by for a visit. Camille hadn't seen Monica in a while, and the idea of reconnecting with her old friend filled her with excitement. She realized how much she had missed the support of her friends during her hospital stay. Monica arrived that afternoon with a bouquet of flowers and a warm hug for Camille. "I've been thinking about you so much," Monica said, settling onto the couch beside her. "I'm so sorry for what you went through." Camille smiled, her heart lightened by Monica's presence. "Thank you." "It was a lot," she admitted, "but I'm doing better now." Monica shook her head, admiration clear in her eyes. "You're so brave, Camille. What you did, standing up for yourself like that, it's incredible. You've always been strong, but this is next level." Camille laughed softly, though her heart swelled with pride at her friend's words. "I didn't feel brave most of the time," she admitted. "I felt scared and vulnerable, but I knew I couldn't stay silent." Monica nodded. "And because of that, you've made a real difference. I've heard about the new advocacy program they're starting at the hospital." "That's huge, Camille. You're going to help so many people." Hearing her friend say those words made it all feel real. The impact of her actions was sinking in, and Camille felt a renewed sense of purpose. She had fought for herself, but she had also fought for others, people who might have been too afraid or too vulnerable to speak up. "Thank you," Camille said, her voice full of emotion. "It's still hard to believe sometimes." Monica smiled, reaching over to give her hand a squeeze. "Believe it. You're a hero, Camille." 2 weeks later, as Camille continued to recover, she received an unexpected phone call from Dr. Carter. "Mrs. Johnson, I wanted to personally invite you to an upcoming hospital event." "Doctor," Carter said, her voice warm and enthusiastic. "We're hosting a ceremony to officially launch the Johnson Patient Advocacy Initiative, and we'd love for you to attend as our honored guest." Camille's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected such recognition, and the idea of being honored in front of the hospital staff felt overwhelming, but also deeply meaningful. I'm honored," Camille replied, her voice full of surprise. "Thank you for inviting me. You've done so much to help us improve our patient care." Dr. Carter continued, "This is just our way of showing our gratitude and ensuring that your legacy of advocacy continues." As Camille ended the call, she sat back, processing the significance of what had just happened. She had never set out to be honored or recognized. All she had wanted was to be treated with the respect and care she deserved. But now, knowing that her actions had led to something greater, Camille felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The day of the ceremony arrived, and Camille and David made their way to the hospital together. The event was being held in a large conference room, and as they walked through the doors, Camille was greeted with warm smiles and nods from staff members, many of whom she had never met. Laura was there, along with several members of the hospital's administration, including Dr. Carter and Mr. Ward. The room was filled with staff, patients, and community members, all gathered to celebrate the launch of the new advocacy program. As Camille took her seat in the front row, David leaned over and whispered, "You ready for this?" Camille smiled, her nerves settling as she looked around the room. "I think I am," she replied softly. The ceremony began with Dr. Carter taking the podium, her voice filled with pride as she spoke about the hospital's commitment to improving patient care and addressing systemic issues that had gone unchecked for too long. We are here today to celebrate the launch of the Johnson Patient Advocacy Initiative. Dr. Carter said, her voice resonating through the room. This program would not exist without the courage and determination of one woman, Mrs. Camille Johnson, who spoke up when it would have been easier to stay silent. A round of applause filled the room, and Camille felt her heart swell with emotion. As she listened to Dr. Carter's words, she realized that this moment was not just about her. It was about every patient who had ever felt voiceless, dismissed, or mistreated. When Dr. Carter invited Camille to the stage to say a few words, Camille took a deep breath and walked to the podium. The applause quieted as she stood before the crowd, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the sides of the podium. "Thank you," Camille began, her voice steady but full of emotion. "I never imagined I'd be standing here today. When I first came to this hospital, I was scared, vulnerable, and in pain. I didn't know if I had the strength to fight for myself, but with the support of my husband, the staff, and the administration, I found my voice." She paused, her eyes scanning the room as she continued. "What happened to me shouldn't happen to anyone. Every patient deserves to be treated with dignity, compassion, and respect, no matter who they are or where they come from. And I'm proud to know that this program will help ensure that no one else has to feel the way I did." Tears welled up in Camille's eyes as the crowd erupted into applause. She stepped back from the podium, overwhelmed by the outpouring of support and gratitude that filled the room. David met her at the bottom of the stage, wrapping her in a tight embrace as the applause continued. "You did it," David whispered in her ear, his voice full of pride. Camille smiled through her tears, her heart full. "We did it," she whispered back. In the months that followed, Camille continued to recover, both physically and emotionally. The hospital's new patient advocacy program was thriving, and Camille found herself becoming more involved, helping to mentor new advocates and sharing her story with others who needed support. Her experience at the hospital had changed her in ways she hadn't expected. What had started as a painful ordeal had transformed into a journey of self-discovery and empowerment. Camille had found her voice, and now she was using it to help others do the same. One evening, as she and David sat on the porch of their home, watching the sun set over the horizon, Camille turned to him with a smile. "I've been thinking about starting a foundation," Camille said quietly. "Something that helps patients who've experienced discrimination in healthcare. I want to do more, not just at St. Joseph's, but everywhere." David's eyes lit up with admiration. "That's an incredible idea," he said, taking her hand in his. "You'd make a real difference." Camille smiled, her heart full of hope and purpose. "It feels like the right thing to do," she said softly. "I've learned that sometimes the hardest experiences can lead to the most meaningful changes." David squeezed her hand, his love for her shining in his eyes. "I'm with you, every step of the way." As they sat together, watching the last rays of sunlight disappear beyond the horizon, Camille knew that this was just the beginning. She had faced her darkest moments and come out stronger on the other side. And now, with David by her side and a renewed sense of purpose, she was ready to help others find their strength too. Thank you so much for following Camille's powerful journey. If you enjoyed this story of courage, resilience, and hope, don't forget to like this video, share it with others, and subscribe to the channel for more inspiring stories just like this one. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. Your support means the world to us. Thank you.